thank you, Mr. Tillerson, for your patience. You can see the finish line from here, I think. We're almost there. I really just have 4 clarifications. I don't think they're going to take very long, just going back to some of the things. On the sanctions piece, to build on what Senator Menendez had just asked you, it's my recollection that your testimony earlier this morning about, I had asked specifically about sanctions on those who conducted cyber attacks against the United States, not specifying Russia in particular, just a bill that said anyone who was guilty of cyber attacks against our infrastructure would be subject to sanctions. And your answer, if I recall correctly, was that we would want to weigh other factors before, that's why you wanted the flexibility and not the mandatory language, because there may be other factors to take into account, such as our trade and economic relations with that country or actor before we chose whether or not to use a tool such as sanctions. So in essence, even if you had information available to you or will in the future about specific actors, that alone may not be enough based on that testimony. There are other factors that you would want to take into account before making your recommendation to the President about whether or not to institute sanctions. Is that a correct characterization?
Yes, it is. And I think the way I would try to explain this, at least why I'm taking this position, sanctions are not a strategy. Sanctions are a tactic. And if we are going to engage, and I'll use Russia in this case, but I can use any other country that these sanctions would apply to, if we're going to engage in trying to address a broad array of serious issues, I'd like to have this as a tool, as a tactic. If it's already played, it's not available to me as a tactic in advancing those discussions and trying to come to some conclusion that best serves America's interests and America's national security interests. It's a powerful tool. I'd like to be able to use it tactically. And if it's already been played, it's not available to me to use tactically. Okay.
The second is a clarification of an exchange you had with Senator Portman about an hour or so ago. He asked you whether there was any sort of cooperation with Iran where we may have a confluence confronting ISIS, working with Iran to confront ISIS. Your answer was that's an area requiring exploration. As I indicated, that's where we have to find a way to engage in the overall process. Just to clarify, does that mean you would be open potentially to working with Iran on issues that we have potentially in common, such as defeating ISIS?
Well, defeating ISIS is the one that's right in front of us, and we're already cooperating with them in Iraq.
Okay. The third question has to do with sanctions on Crimea. Against Senator Portman's question, I believe your answer was, and I caught it on television, I had just stepped out at the tail end of the first round, and he asked, and I think your testimony was along the lines of, we won't change anything right away after we examine the situation, but embedded in that was the notion that potentially at some point there could be an arrangement in which the United States would recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea if the government in Kiev signed off on it or accepted it as part of a broader deal to ensure peace and stability. Is that an accurate assessment of the testimony as I heard it?
I think what I was trying to recognize is that since that was territory that belongs to Ukraine, Ukraine will have something to say about it in the context of a broader solution to some kind of a lasting agreement. I'm not saying that is on the table. I'm merely saying I don't think that's ours alone to decide.
Okay, here's my last clarification, and it's more about the hearing here today in general. When in the end of the last round, at the end of the questioning, you said that there was some misunderstanding in alluding to human rights. You said we share the same values, but that you are clear-eyed and realistic about it, end quote. So I wanted you to understand the purpose of the questions I've asked you today because they are in pursuit of clarity and realism. On the clarity front, I was very pleased when your statement today used the term moral clarity because I think we've been missing that for the last 8 years. And that's why I asked you about whether Vladimir Putin was a war criminal, something that you declined to label him as. I asked about China, whether they were one of the worst human rights violators in the world, which again, you didn't want to compare them to other countries. I asked about the killings in the Philippines. I asked about Saudi Arabia being a human rights violator, which you also declined to label them. And the reason was not because I was trying to get you involved in the name of international name-calling, but for the sake of name-calling, but because in order to have moral clarity, we need clarity. We can't achieve moral clarity with rhetorical ambiguity. I also did it in pursuit of realism, because here's what's realistic. You said that you didn't want to label them because it would somehow hurt our chances to influence them or our relationship with him. But here's the reality. If confirmed by the Senate, and you run the Department of State, you're going to have to label countries and individuals all the time. You expressed today support for the Magnitsky Act, which specifically labels individuals and sanctions them. You are going to have to designate nations as sponsors of terrorism or organizations as terror groups. Again, a label. And one that I think a lot of us care about is the Trafficking in Persons Report, which specifically labels countries and ranks them based on how good a job they're doing. And that one really concerns me because in that one, over the last year, there's evidence that the rankings and the tier system has been manipulated for political purposes. They upgraded Cuba, they upgraded Malaysia, because we're working with them now to improve relations, and we didn't want to have a label out there that hurt the chances of doing that. And so that's why I think it's important for you to, but here's the last reason. You gave the need for a lot more information in order to comment on some of these. And believe me, I understand that it's a big world, there's a lot of topics. These were not obscure areas. And I can tell you that, number one, the questions I asked did not require access to any sort of special information that we have. All these sources were built on voluminous open source reporting, rights groups, the leaders sometimes themselves when it comes to the Philippines, the State Department, et cetera. And so we're not going off news reports alone. But the selling point for your nomination has been that while you don't have experience in government and in foreign policy, you have traveled the world extensively, you have relationships all over the world, and you have a real understanding of some of these issues as a result of that. Yet, today I've been unable to get you to acknowledge that the attacks on Aleppo were conducted by Russia and that in fact they are or would be considered under any standard human rights, that somehow you're unaware about what's happening in the Philippines, that you don't or are not prepared to label what's happening in China and Saudi Arabia, a country that, my understanding, you're quite aware of. Women have no rights in that country. That's well documented. If you visited there, and anyone who has, they would know. Now, I want you to understand this, too. And I said this to you when we met. I have no questions about your character, your patriotism. You don't need this job. You didn't campaign for this job. It sounds like a month and a half ago someone had said that you were going to be up here today. You'd say, that's not true. That's not what there's only one reason for you to be sitting behind that table today, and that's your love for this country and your willingness to serve it. And I do admire that. I do. But I also told you when we met that the position that you've been nominated to is, in my opinion, the second most important position in the U.S. government, with all due respect to the Vice President. It is the face of this country for billions of people, for hundreds of millions of people as well, and particularly for people that are suffering and they're hurting. For those people, those 1,400 people in jail in China, those dissidents in Cuba, the girls that want to drive and go to school, they look to the United States. They look to us, and often to the Secretary of State. And when they see the United States is not prepared to stand up and say, yes, Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, Saudi Arabia violates human rights, we deal with these countries because they have the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, because China is the second largest economy in the world, because Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner in what's happening in the Middle East. But we still condemn what they do. It demoralizes these people all over the world. And it leads people to conclude this, which is damaging, and it hurt us during the Cold War, and that is this. America cares about democracy and freedom as long as it's not being violated by someone that they need for something else. That cannot be who we are in the 21st century. We need a Secretary of State that will fight for these principles. That's why I asked for these questions. That's why I asked those questions, because I believe it's that important for the future of the world that America lead now more than ever. So I thank you for your patience today.